After a decade-long wait, I have finally finished my first playthrough of Dragon Age the Veilguard, and it's safe to say, at least in my personal opinion, that this was a very good RPG that is held back by pretty poor dialogue and writing in a lot of different instances. But what overshadows that is the combat, the gameplay and the actual mechanics feeling very smooth and impactful, the depth of the progression of your character and your companions, all of the different very distinct and beautiful environments that you can explore. The level design, which I thought took a lot of inspiration from God of War, ended up being a very good recreation of that type of design. And on top of this, you have a very long but also crafted experience with 0 fetch quests, and through my entire gameplay, I probably only experienced maybe 1 bug that I couldn't recreate. But before I get into all of this and what I liked about the game and what I was disappointed about, thank you guys so much for 700 subscribers. My goal is to hopefully hit 1,000 by the end of this month, so I would really appreciate it if you like gaming news and you like gaming reviews and you like the video you see here. Please subscribe, it helps me out a lot. Now let's get into the review. So to preface this review, I put about 50 hours into the game so far, where I didn't complete every faction or every companion mission, but I did a large majority of them. But not completing all these definitely came back to bite me in the ass in the end. But I also want to say that this is not going to be a game for everybody. Specifically, if you are a fan of tactical combat or some of the old Dragon Age games, this might not be the game for you specifically, but for what this game was and the quote-unquote reboot this was for the Dragon Age series, I felt like this was a very good RPG that did a lot of things right. And before I want to get to the things that it did wrong, I want to talk about what I thought was genuinely good here, starting with the combat. The combat in this game from the start all the way to the end is something I thoroughly enjoyed and that never got stale for me. There are so many different options here with your multiple abilities, with everything you can combine with your companion's abilities as well, with your block, with your dodges, with your parries, with your light attacks and heavy attacks and the different combos depending on what weapon and class you end up choosing. You also have your jump attacks, you also have your weak points which you can exploit, all tied together and combined with a great progression system with so many different multiplicatives to boost up your damage to make a very distinctive and very fun build. I personally went with the specialization to Deathcaller, and what I was able to do halfway and closer to the end of the game was get my health down as low as possible, have multiple different things within my skill trees that boosted my damage for having low health, going and getting very unique items that wouldn't let me go above 70% health and increase my low health damage and increase the low health threshold to where I was going in and popping off. I'd put as many afflictions as I could on them, get extra damage for my afflictions, extra damage for all of my necrosis and my stacks, increase the duration of my stacks and how many stacks I could put on an enemy, and get as many resistances as I wanted, and then turn my resistances into damage multipliers and literally destroy people. And I was basically invincible because every one of my abilities also used my health, which kept going down, but also regenerated my health, so I literally couldn't die, and I kept doing more and more and more and more damage. And all of this is tied with detonations as well that worked with Weakened and Sunders with Lucanus and Davrin. If you guys want a video on this build, I am more than happy to do it. It was crazy, it was so much fun. My only main gripe here, I think, isn't even with the combat, but with the enemy variety. A lot of times you're fighting reused enemies or reused bosses in the game that have a lot of reused mechanics. However, I will say, even with some of the bosses, there are unique bosses, and there are also bosses that have mechanics that you have definitely seen before, but they at least have 1 or 2 that distinguish themselves between some of the other bosses that are similar. And within a 40, 50, 60 hour experience, I definitely think it's okay to have some reused content. But I'll also say, if you're not someone who likes action combat, you're not going to like this action combat in this game. If you're someone who likes the tactical combat from the previous Dragon Age games and that's the combat you prefer, then this isn't a combat system that you're obviously going to enjoy. But now I want to talk about the progression and how you're actually able to do this and how many different options you have to build up your character in a lot of different ways. So there is a lot tied to progression here. And first I want to start off with your character and specifically with your specialization, which you're going to unlock unlock at level 20. You can get a new ultimate ability. On top of that, you can get new active abilities as well as passives in your pretty damn expansive skill tree. You then have your gear, which you can upgrade in 2 different ways. The first is just increasing the base stats by using materials you find throughout the world, going back to your lighthouse, talking to the caretaker of the lighthouse, which is the guy within the main hub, and then this will be able to increase your base stats if you have those materials. Now, you can also increase the rarity of these items by either buying the same item from a merchant or finding that same item in a chest. And this is going to be the most important because each upgrade is going to actually unlock a new bonus on that piece of gear. So all of the different pieces of gear can get to either yellow or a unique item, and they have 4 different bonuses that can also apply to your character. And as you're upgrading the caretaker within your main hub, you'll also unlock enchantments, which basically are just a 5th bonus on each piece of gear that can really benefit and make your character so much stronger. And on top of this progression, there is also this dagger that you have that you can put gems in to also unlock pretty special bonuses and kind of just work like a 4th ability on your bar. And with your companions, which you can have 2 of in combat, you can also upgrade each of their individual abilities with their own skill trees, as well as upgrading both the plus on their armor as well as the rarity for more bonuses. And one thing that I didn't like in my initial first impressions were that you couldn't be revived by your companions, but by getting specific gear for them, you can actually have revives where they can come over and revive you and feel like they're more of a team dynamic in the fight than just kind of a benefit to your character, but other than that, not necessarily their own entities. So overall, I really enjoyed the combat, which was tied together with a great progression system that made the combat even more enjoyable, which was already a very smooth and impactful experience, in my opinion at least. So shifting gears here to another thing that I really enjoyed about this game was the environments in the level design. There are so many different environments in this game that feel very distinctive from one another, so every time you're going to a new environment, you don't just feel that slog of seeing the same thing over and over and over again. And although I'm not a huge fan of the art style, which I'll talk about a little bit later in this review, the environments were done absolutely beautifully. And this is tied together with a level design that I initially thought was too linear in my first impressions. But once you get past that 10-hour or so mark, these areas open up so much more. When you're doing your faction quests or your companion quests to increase their bond or get them better gear, or just not have a catastrophe happen at the end of the game, which we'll talk about, it feels like a very good recreation, like I was saying at the start of the video, of that God of War formula, where you're constantly doing different puzzles and things to find new pieces of gear and open new chests or get new resources as you're exploring these pretty damn large but still relatively linear areas. And through this, you're going to be using your different companion abilities as well as the Dreadwolf's dagger to really do all of these different puzzles and get to places that you weren't really able to get to the first time. And all of these are held together by something called the crossroads, and this really is where you're going to be going to then also go through something called an alluvion, which is basically a mirror that you use to teleport through to different environments. But this isn't just an area you do that in. This area has its own content, in some of the best content in the game, specifically within this crossroads. My favorite thing to do in this game, genuinely, was doing the giant gate bosses, which you go to different areas in the game, you beat these gigantic bosses, then you go back to the crossroads, you use their essence to unlock more areas within the crossroads, which you can then unlock statues for more health or more ability points, and then fight these kind of penultimate bosses that you can definitely beat even if you are a much lower level than them, and then they're going to give you legit unique pieces that you can't find anywhere else in the game that in some scenarios are genuinely build defining. They at least were for my build. And yes, some might say you aren't supposed to beat these bosses but they're so much higher of a level, but usually I like games where they have mechanics where if you do them perfectly, you can actually take out bosses even if they're a much higher level. So this might be a bad thing for some people, but it was at least a good thing for me. But now I want to move over to some of the things that I was disappointed about, because although I think all of this overshadows the things I was disappointed about, there are issues with this game that I think do hold it back from being something like a Game of the Year contender, at least in my opinion. And the first big thing is the dialogue. The dialogue really pulled me out of the game a lot of the different times because it didn't fit the tone of what the Dragon Age world is. And I understand that they definitely wanted to go with a more lighthearted, a more quirky and funny and more Marvel type of tone here, but it just didn't work in terms of the lore that was already established within the Dragon Age universe. And although I don't think the dialogue or the writing is as bad as everybody is making it out to seem, especially with the clips that you're seeing online, it definitely ruined my immersion at times because I'm someone who did love the previous Dragon Age games and loved the dark fantasy type of lore and environments that I came to know and love through the pre-existing games within this franchise. And even if you're not a Dragon Age fan, I think overall the writing and the dialogue just is pretty elementary. I don't think the team that wrote this game or wrote the different dialogue options or the dialogue in general with the different characters or your character even as Rook were very talented. It hurts me to say that, but when people are cracking jokes and cracking quips when there's elven gods destroying the entire world and threatening everybody's lives, it just doesn't fit. It just feels very weird. The game also constantly explains the same thing over and over and over and over and over to you like you didn't understand it the first time. It's like rehashing the same things that you just went over 10 seconds later because you didn't understand it when they originally explained it or showed it to you. You also don't have enough dialogue options to be mean. You can't really be a mean character in this game. Even if you do say something, the character will pretty much just say a completely different thing, which results in you not necessarily thinking you have really the freedom that you hopefully should have in one of these games. And that's not to say the voice acting isn't good. I think given different material, the voice actors did a phenomenal job. But what the characters are saying and how they're acting during different situations of the game don't feel at all like someone in real life would react to one of these situations. And obviously, this is a fantasy game, so they can do whatever they want. It just, for me, did not work and really rubbed me the wrong way in moments that I thought should be more somber or I thought should be more consequential for the different characters in the game. And I think this can also be seen with the companions. And although I did like some of the companions here, and I don't want to spoil their stories, but people like Davrin and Lucanus, I really found myself enjoying being around and specifically doing their companion quests. Even someone like Nev, who I think is unique, and there's not as much combat through her specific companion quest, but I think it's a unique take on a character within this game as a whole. But there's also characters that I really could not stand being around, Balara being the main one. I literally had to get her out of my party immediately. I didn't do her companion quests just because her constant quips and her quirkiness really bogged me down after a while. I think Lace Harding can be a little bit annoying after a while as well, even though I kind of liked her in Inquisition. She just seems very optimistic here even when a very dire situation is happening, and overall that's a very constant thing that happens in this game as well. Your companions might fight for 1 or 2 seconds, but overall you can just say one thing as Rook, as the main character, and they'll kind of get over it and then be very optimistic in the most dire situation where the world is constantly ending. And again, with the dialogue and the writing and with the tone as a whole, I just don't think it fits very well and doesn't really make me enjoy these companions as much as I have in the previous games. And then there's also some other companions that I thought were okay. I didn't overly love or hate, like Tosh, who is pretty badass at times, but then you also have someone like Emmerich, who is also relatively badass at times, but I didn't really resonate super well with their stories as a whole. Again, don't want to spoil them. So there were good companions, bad companions, and companions I was a little bit mixed on, but overall I just didn't like how they interacted with each other or your character. And going back to Tosh, I want to talk about them for a second because Tosh has had a lot of controversy, and a lot of the people coming out and saying this game is woke garbage and has DEI and everything is kind of centered around a lot of these situations that happen with Tosh. And again, I don't think the dialogue or writing was very good here when talking about them as a character or the different experiences they go through for their own selves, but I also don't think DEI is something that can make a good game bad or a bad game good. I've said that in previous videos. This review and just this game in general, I want to focus on the mechanics, the gameplay, and the writing and the dialogue and what actually matters and what you're going to be playing with in this game that's going to make it a good or bad experience. So that's all I'm going to say about that. So let's move on. And also, going into some of the returning characters like Isabella or Morgan or Varric, I don't think they added too much to the story here. And I think because of them coming into this tone and trying to switch their whole tone, I didn't resonate with these characters as a whole like I did in the previous games. Varric, for example, is supposed to be kind of that person that can kind of work you through leading the Veilguard as a whole, and again, he's very optimistic in every situation, just kind of reinforcing that you're making the right decisions and that it's all going to be okay, and I just thought that was a little bit off-putting. Another thing I was a little bit off-put by was the art style. The art style was not my cup of tea, not something I personally preferred, although I definitely got used to it, and I think you will get used to it after a couple hours of playing the game as well. You'll get used to what the characters look like, and I think the art style works really well for the beautiful environments that they did craft. I just wasn't my preferred art style within this game that I just think reinforced a tone where they didn't want to take risks or get as dark as they really could get. There are some moments of this though, with the start of the game where people are getting thrown off ledges in the intro, the Blight Town, which has a lot of mangled up people that are just absolutely getting strangled by these tentacles and have these black pulsating veins coming out of them. I thought that was really cool. Even in the wetlands area where the Grey Wardens are fighting off the Blight, there are literally pools of blood everywhere you go because of how many Grey Wardens have died, and overall, I think this is so cool. However, I still didn't love the art style. It wasn't preferred for me, and they definitely tried to reinforce the tone that they did not want to get as dark as they could have gotten in this game. Now, the last thing I want to talk about was a little mixed bag between good and bad, and that is the choices and consequences, because I am genuinely somebody in an RPG, you should be able to be whoever the hell you want to be in an RPG, and you should make choices based on whoever the hell you want to be within your RPG. And I think there were good choices here, but they were all packed into the end of the game, which genuinely was one of the greatest final outcomes in a game that I have played. It reminded me so much of Mass Effect 2 and how they did that, and all your decisions throughout the game really lead up until the end of the game. That was great. The problem was not having a lot of choices up until that point. I felt like a lot of the dialogue and a lot of the times I was talking between characters, other than like the romantic options, which I'll get to that in a second, but I thought overall they were just pretty poor and they didn't really matter until the end of the game, where they very much mattered. So a little bit of a mixed bag for me there. The end of the game was, again, absolutely fantastic, and if the end of the game and those type of choices took place throughout the entire game, this could potentially be one of the best RPGs ever, but unfortunately, they didn't have that throughout the entire game. It was really only packed into the finale. And that's not to say there wasn't any choices. At the start of the game, there are some good choices that you can choose. The problem is they just don't have very lasting consequences, like when you're choosing between to take one companion or another into a fight. Yeah, they might go away for a little bit because they're bruised up, both physically and mentally, just not ready to fight, but then they come back pretty soon after, and not really much changes from that. So the big consequential ones, again, just aren't throughout the entire game. And then you also have your romance choices, which I chose Nev specifically as mine, and there just wasn't too much there with the romance as a whole. The writing and dialogue, again, with the romance is pretty kind of cringy at times, even though I don't really like to say that word, but overall, it was okay. I appreciate romance options in games. I like doing that. It just wasn't the most thought out or fulfilled romantic experience with your choices with who you want to romance as your companion. So overall, what do I think about this game? Well, all things considered, this is a pretty damn good RPG all the way through, especially if you weren't someone who played previous Dragon Age games and came in with a certain expectation or preconceived notion of what you thought this game was supposed to be. And I genuinely think that's who this was made for the most. I really enjoyed the combat as a whole. I really enjoyed the progression and being able to craft my build and continue to craft my build and refine it all the way up until the end game. I really enjoyed the different environments and the level design that I thought was a great recreation, or at least took a lot of inspiration and did it well from the God of War games, or at least the new ones. And there were decisions, especially at the end of the game, I thought they were good and I thought they were impactful, and the finale of this game was one of the best gaming finales and endings of a game I've played in a very long time, if not ever. And yes, I do think this game was held back a decent amount by the dialogue, by the writing, by the companions, their interactions with each other, and with you as Rook, the one leading the Veilguard. I also think they did the returning characters a little bit dirty, not not giving them enough to work with, although I think the voice acting for all of this was pretty good, like I mentioned, and if they had different writing, I think people would say the voice acting was incredible. So if you are someone like me who really emphasizes the enjoyment within an RPG based on a lot of the combat and the progression, I think you're going to really enjoy this game as a whole. If you are someone obviously who likes tactical combat, this won't be the game for you because there's none of that in it, but if you are an RPG fan that doesn't really care about combat and more cares about the writing, the dialogue, and the character interactions, I think you probably won't enjoy this game as much. You might, I'm not saying you won't, but it just wasn't for my tastes in terms of that. But what they set out to do for this game, I think they did a pretty good job. No, this isn't Game of the Year contender, but I think it's definitely better than a mediocre game for sure. So my final rating here, which is higher than I had within my first impressions, is an 8 out of 10. And I think it could definitely get up there if they improved the dialogue and the writing with the characters, like I've mentioned 100 times now. Thank you guys for watching this review. I would love to hear feedback down below on how I presented everything, as well as if you agree or disagree with me, because that's okay. You are allowed to like this game more than me, and you're allowed to not like this game as much as me. I just want to hear your guys' opinions and what you guys thought about this game and your experience specifically. So again, thanks for watching this review. Like if you liked the video, subscribe for more content like this, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace!